Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. I want to talk about a facet of managing and working with psychic ability that maybe hasn't occurred to you or maybe isn't something that you're being as thoughtful about as you might be, and there might be some serious advantages and upgrades to your experience with some adjustments and tweaking. So one of the things that I believe to be true is that we have this amazing era of so many old souls incarnating at the same time. And I think that there's a lot of excitement for being on the ground, on the planet, co-creating some of the transformations in these really pivotal times. And as someone who studied history and finds it interesting, I think those pivotal times where how humans organize their lives move dramatically are just really interesting, where, we moved from feudalism to this notion of democracies as a radical new notion, and, all of these kind of big changes. And goodness gracious, with the rate of technology and everything that's going on with humanity, it's a really intense, sometimes take apart, sometimes, quite psychically noisy and challenging, but a really dynamic time. And I feel like there are a lot of souls who maybe took a hiatus after they were a sheep farmer enough times in the dark ages. They were like, not that interesting. But they've come in, and they're also souls that haven't really done much incarnation on the planet, who are bringing particular vibrations and gifts to the world. So it's a really dynamic time, and it's an interesting contrast because in addition to all of these people who have, frankly, for different reasons, a lot of psychic gifts, a lot of psychic ability, untrained, which can be pretty miserable. I talk a lot about how my energetic sensitivity as a child was so acute that I was dissociative as a result. And I had no language. I had no vocabulary. I had no idea that, this press of energy that I was feeling that made me want to retreat into myself wasn't something that everybody was reckoning with. And so with all of these people, with all of this psychic ability, a lot of which is untrained, and I would argue that psychic ability, when you don't have a kind of a fundamental 101, so it doesn't have to be this like huge expert PhD understanding, but I feel like there's a basic layperson for the psychic and energetically sensitive competency about psychic protections and filters and shields and how energetic pathways between people work and how to protect your home and how to keep your space energetically clean. And there's just kind of a basic understanding. And I think it's a good analogy to compare it to the deliverables we expect of people in terms of competency as adults managing our physical bodies. So as children, of course, other people help us understand the need for eat and sleep and drink some water and how injured we are when there's blood on the outside and, all of these different experiences. And as an adult, we know how to diagnose when something is serious enough to need medical attention, whether we want to keep an eye on it and see how it goes, whether we need to do more research, whether we just maybe got a little dehydrated and should drink some water. The care and feeding of the physical body at a fundamental level, not the physician level, but just the kind of basic, I understand what's going on with my body and when to get help with that is really important. And similarly, I think it's really important for psychic and energetically sensitive people to have that foundation. So, of course, I made a program, my Energy Body Illumination, and my academy goes through rather comprehensively all the things that I think fall under this basic kind of 101 aspect. But there's a particular piece that I didn't put in there at the time that has recently sort of shown up in a lot of different ways, and I want to share it here on the podcast. So one of the categories of people that I work with a lot are people who feel like they're experiencing entity attachment and having beings that are interacting with them that they don't want to have interacting with them. And it's a tricky, kind of complicated thing to work with. No two experiences look quite the same. The root causes can be a lot of different things, or just, wow, no idea why this really uncomfortable thing is happening to you. And so I'm not going to go into that, but it sort of illuminated an aspect which has to do with being psychically open and available at inappropriate times and in inappropriate ways. And the entity side of it is, a much more significant part when people, who really want to talk to their guides can't tell the difference between a being that will take their energy in some way and a being that has unconditional compassion and generosity and very aligned and boundaried support. Like, the difference between an entity and a spirit guide is significant. And if you don't know who you're talking to, a whole lot of kerfuffles can ensue from that. But happily, there are lots of people who aren't particularly troubled with entities. The parts of them that are interfacing with the unseen world are, doing a good job, but they don't really have formal training. They haven't onboarded kind of a basic, it's a learnable skill to work with these gifts in a way that aligns with this weird, wacky modern life. Now, big fan of modern life. Love the whole indoor plumbing, heating and cooling. I grew up in an old farmhouse that was pretty much at an uncomfortable temperature the vast majority of the year. So huge fan of how much choice we have and how much comfort and how much freedom from fleas and bed bugs those of us in developed countries enjoy. So yay for the modern era. But it's very taxing for energetically sensitive people to be in a society where people can be so messy with their energy and have no idea. People throw psychic attacks as a result of emotional trigger without even realizing that's what they're doing. Back in the day, historically with shamanism, you were protecting against deliberate psychic attacks and black magic. Today, there's a lot less of that. Not saying there's none, but there's less of it. But there's a lot more people just, stewing over their ex's bad behavior and not realizing they're sending energy, and just the loudness and the fact that we don't have sort of per capita enough people doing spirit release work to help those who die suddenly or get confused to go on their way. We've moved away from certain kinds of death rituals that help souls to find their way. So the upshot is, there's a lot of really cool stuff about the modern era. And it can also be a really hard place for someone with a lot of untrained psychic ability that's just doing its thing willy-nilly rather than kind of being directed. And I don't have ADHD, so this may be a really, annoying false equivalency to put together, but I have, sat with a lot of people who had that experience, and that all the sensory input, working in a way where it's really hard to focus and tune things out, and you're overstimulated and your attention is pulled in all these different directions, and it's hard to hold the continuity because your brain is, value tagging things around you as worth paying attention to. And there can be a lot of really amazing, cool, creative things that happen, but it can also be really difficult to work with some of the systems that we're expected to work with, like the schools and structures of employment and things like that. And similarly with psychic ability, if we can have a volume switch, so we're really open in an old growth forest, but if we're riding the subway or at the airport, we can, pull our energy and filter a little more heavily. So there's this adjustability to how open or closed our psychic ability is at any given time. And we can be very boundaried of being very effective and having the self-trust of I can keep other people's energy out. So that's something that is a really great thing walking around the world to be able to be like, yeah, I've got this. I don't love a psychically noisy environment, but yeah, I can take care of myself. I can move through that. It'll be fine. So there's a lot of merit, I think, to just the fundamentals of managing your energetic sensitivity and your psychic ability and being able to focus it where you want and being able to tune out the white noise and all the background and to have sovereignty over your energetic space. I think these are all really, really important things. And certainly my own life, my quality of life was vastly improved when I got into my 20s and I started onboarding this knowledge and these competencies. And one of the things that I believe to be true in my own life, and I see a lot in my clients, is a lot of people who's basically developed excellent psychic ability in past lives. So they come into this lifetime with a huge amount of ability to do certain things, but no training and not necessarily even any vocabulary or having that validated. It's a kind of a wacky thing. And the sort of historic context for this, if you were in a shamanic society and you had a lot of psychic ability, you would have been tapped for either being trained as a shaman for the tribe or even just a helper or an assistant. There would have been this specialized training. And if I were in charge of the world, in school they scan you for scoliosis and, dyslexia and all of these things, I would have children scanned for energetic sensitivity and just pull them into a little bit of extra training. It would save so much grief if we got the basics just as part of the oh, you have this extra sense. You're going to want to have some volitional control over it. Things will go better for you. And another interesting thing that factors into this whole, soup of interesting experiences, we have the high, levels of old souls incarnating, and we have this really wild take apart and new opportunity times. And another thing that I find really interesting is the vibration has really come up. I have been at this a long time. This is my 25th year in practice, and I remember, going through the lead up to 2012 and all the discussions of the vibration is coming up in the world. And that sounds really cool. It's actually kind of uncomfortable because it can create a lot of detox and dismantling of old systems that are, trying to sustain their stability and, just lots of things. I remember back pre 2012, people genuinely thinking like we would just not be dealing with money post 2012. It's like, oh, that's so outdated. And I just remember laughing because I'm like, wow, humans are co-creating money so vigorously. I really trust the continuity of this sort of fundamental organizing principle in a format that will adjust, will shift and grow, but looks pretty appreciably similar to what we're doing now. But I digress. So the point of this vibration rising is it makes it a lot easier to connect to spirit. So what I've been shown by my guides is like back in the day, you really had to do a lot of practices to get that connection to spirit. There was a really significant vibrational contrast between some of the more ascended master teachers and beings that work with us, that help us. So there was more ritual needed, there was more meditation needed, there was more purification needed. And from my experience, like the notion of needing to go, fast for 3 days in order to get connected to spirit sounds, really absurd because it's something I can connect to, in a breath. I can just shift my attention over to talking to my spirit guides. And incidentally, I would argue for most people who are in a female body and a lot of people who are in a male body, that whole suffering to get closer to spirit is a bit counterindicated, and particularly for women because a lot of times we don't bring our energy fully into our body. We're much more active often in the upper chakras than the lower chakras, and I would argue that we have the most success if all the chakras are working together as a team. They're all vibrant and dynamic and doing their thing. And a lot of those practices are for men, and mileage varies a lot, especially these days. People are switching it up for gender incarnations in interesting ways. But for a lot of men, their energy was more anchored in the lower chakras, and they needed to move the energy up to connect to spirit. So a lot of what's been handed down are traditions that are about helping men raise their energy to get connected to spirit, and fasting, extreme physical efforts, a lot of uncomfortable things can be helpful for that. But the cool thing is, and I think what a lot of us experience is we can be checking in with spirit kind of real time. And as with so many things in the modern era, it has some really cool aspects that we can just, shift our awareness from ordinary reality into non-ordinary reality and connect on the fly, kind of real time. So it has some really amazing gifts, but it also creates some problems and challenges and things that can diminish your quality of life if they don't, get handled properly. And so one of the things I think that's useful to just sort of look at is when we start to look at traditional practices. So I, of course, dabbled in many things, had lots of different experiences, took lots of different classes. But when you start to look at traditional shamanism, which is not what I practice a very modern version that I've worked out with my guides. I am not a ritualist. There are people who love ritual. I think ritual is beautiful. I've done ritual. There's richness that comes from ritual. But I'm also very much a pragmatist and a former engineer. And so I have found that the return on investment for what I'm wanting to connect with for an elaborate ritual versus something that has more efficiency doesn't quite add up for me. So nothing against ritual. Yay, ritual, wonderful place, great thing for people to experience. However, it just may not be your jam, and it's totally okay if it's not your jam. However, it's worth noting that all of the kind of teachings that come from days of yore, as best we can understand them as they've been handed down, really have to do with opening sacred space, having an experience with spirit, and closing sacred space. So they're, again, overcoming this higher vibration, being really intentional about what we were doing with our magic. These kind of things have this process where we move through the steps of I've created a container. I've stopped multitasking and, I'm not doing the dishes. I've stepped into this protection, and now I'm going to open up the psychic ability and have this experience. And then I'm going to close down the places. And I still, get way more detailed and clear information when I don't just kind of tune into my guides, which I do. That's the nature of how I move through the world. But when I still listen to the drum for that altered state, and it does things for me, which is putting me into that state, but also drums and rattles and calling of the quarters if you're Wiccan, all of these things are a way of telling spirit, hey, I'm ready to listen, I'm here, I'm getting present. So there's this really potent coming together. And this isn't to say, only talk to your spirit guides when you're in sacred space. Now, if you're having entity problems, it may be necessary not to talk to spirit. And I have some different wisdom on how to still access that wisdom, but by going to your inner wise one rather than out to your spirit guides if you don't know who you're talking to. If you aren't able to command your space and be boundaried and know that you're talking to legitimate spirit guides and not entities that have a different agenda, it's really not a good idea to do things like shamanic journey, especially not that just flipping your awareness into non-ordinary reality. And if you're in a place where, you've had some issues, it's kind of, medium research and development, try things, see how they work. But I would recommend anyone who has fear or has had difficulties going back to those foundational practices of calling in sacred space, many, many different ways to do it, but setting a protected container before you open those pathways. So I think that that's a really important thing. And I think that our ancestors really needed to do that. And wacky modern people with all of our like soul history and ability and the higher vibration and such, just have this capacity to just flip our awareness into non-ordinary reality as we're, going about life. And this can actually be really problematic because there are a lot of people who can't close the doors. And again, that's a demographic of my clients. But for people who aren't having that problem, it can really interfere with being grounded, with being in the body, with having the situational awareness to be attentive to the physical world, to even just having discernment about other people, to noticing when something in your life is starting to go down a pathway. It's really hard when, you see someone going down a pathway and you're like, oh wow, that you're on a track that if you don't pivot, you don't have major health problems now, but that's taking you in a direction where, future you is going to have potentially a lot harder time. And I'm deeply invested in future me having a really delightful, wonderful, joyful time. And so I want to pivot any participation in the world that isn't a balance between having good quality of life now and setting future me up for really good experiences. And so there's a whole lot of downsides to not being in your body. You're vulnerable to accidents. You just really can't get your magic to act on the world. And for a lot of people, it kind of becomes a catch-22 where their circumstances are difficult in some way. There can be money struggles, health struggles, relationship struggles. They can feel really trapped and stuck. They're in a job that pays the bills. They don't have another, option lined up or that's easy or straightforward. And yet it makes them not want to be here. So the more that they sort of leave their body and disconnect and dissociate and zone out and tune out and numb themselves and all of those kind of things, the less their magic and self-efficacy and resourcefulness and ability to curate a life that, would really work for them, would really have more of a what's in it for you kind of factor to life. And so it's a tricksy kind of problem where we really need to be in our bodies to give ourselves the best incarnation experience. And honestly, we went through a lot of trouble to get here. And it doesn't mean that you are necessarily enjoying it. We could spend a ton of money on a trip, plan it, be so excited, and get there and be like, wow, it's not like what it looked like on Instagram. I enjoy the content creators on YouTube who are like, here's the beautiful thing, and then here's the huge crowd that is all together filming the beautiful thing, which is, edited out of pictures. Shots are taken strategically to erase the giant crowd of people who are all, jostling and it's just not as serene as it could be. So all of that just is to say you may have, gone through a lot of trouble to get here on the planet and not be, really savoring it and enjoying it. However, it is really worthwhile to be in the body for a whole bunch of reasons, health and well-being, and also, we're this blend of human animal and human spirit. And when human spirit leaves the conversation and disengages, human animal starts running the show. And human animal is very frightened of the world, very anxious. It has a lot of really outdated strategies that were good for hunter-gatherer people and are really dysfunctional for modern humans. The ability to, really work with a life that you enjoy isn't on the radar of human animal. Human animal is just really about survive, survive, survive. And so when it's kind of like a dog that's left in the yard that's just barking and barking and barking and barking, that's a hard experience. And there's so much that's neat and rich and amazing about dogs. But when they're, just left in solitary confinement out in a yard with no human engagement or attunement or presence or thoughtfulness, it goes a different direction. It's not super great. So we really want to, get in the game of being human as long as we're here so that we can have the best possible experience. And one of the things I find about a lot of these psychically gifted people is we have a lot easier time sending our awareness out into the cosmos or talking to our spirit guides than we do bringing it back. We go better than we come back. And I imagine that has to do with, again, the higher vibrational gap. So there was a lot more work in past lives, teaching ourselves to go and, not living these, lives where we can do a lot of things on autopilot and not die, when we're back to, being in the world and, kind of the situational awareness. It's been speculated that our ancestors ruminated a lot less because they were out and about in the outdoors and needed to pay attention to bugs and snakes and, gathering water and, all of these different like real-time experiences. There was more need to be situationally aware, which doesn't particularly yield itself to rumination. But whatever the root cause, it's really useful, I believe, to be really clean about where you're choosing to have your awareness. So for me, I mentioned I can flip my awareness into shamanic reality very quickly. I mean, it's the result of how much I've done this. And I love that. I can get information, but then I'm very aware of when I bring it back to the 3D world. So a lot of times people are just having this sort of amorphous, things are open, they're not in protected sacred space, and that can be physically dangerous. It's not a great thing to do while you're, say, driving a car, and we can lose or just never develop the muscle that allows us to choose whether we're in ordinary or non-ordinary reality. And having the choice not be volitional causes a lot of problems. A lot of, I'm not saying it's the whole of schizophrenia. There are lots of aspects, but that's part of it is you just don't have volitional control over where your awareness is. And it can be really, really scary and really upsetting. And that can really impair your life experience in a lot of different ways. So my invitation and my recommendation is to, by all means, connect to spirit and talk to spirit. And if you're having really good results, then, you don't necessarily have to have the formality of calling in sacred space. If you feel like sometimes you get bad information or you don't know where you go or your energy feels worse afterwards, there can be all these subtle signs that maybe that's not working so well. You can move to a more formal discipline for a while of setting up sacred space and then communing with spirit. I think it's really worthwhile to really settle in and have the conversation instead of just kind of tuning in to alleviate boredom while you're washing the dishes. So that can be a really useful thing. But even if you're doing this, tuning in, I don't think it's unreasonable to be doing muscle testing in the health food store to decide if your body is interested in a particular supplement or a particular food. But that sort of beginning, middle, end. When I was getting ready to do this podcast, the guides were popping into my head that child song of open, shut them, open, shut them. And you're practicing in playing with the fact that, it's a different experience when you open your eyes or close your eyes, and there's a hand gesture that goes with it. And I think that that's really good wisdom for our psychic ability. Open, shut, where we close that, because the trouble is that those pathways, when they're just sort of open, it's a little bit like you dial somebody on the phone and then you've had the conversation, you just set down the phone and walk away and the phone line's still open. That's not so ideal. At the very minimum, it's going to pull your battery down. It ties up the phone and you can't use it for other things that are darn useful with modern phones. And that's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is that there can be all of these other effects. So it's an opening in your energy field that you probably don't want to have when you're wandering around the grocery store. And I know I mentioned entities, and people who have entities and don't realize they have entities fare a lot better than people who realize they have entities and are really triggered by the fact that they have entities. And that's not volitional. It's an experience. So I'm not saying oh, don't be triggered. I have hours and hours and hours of talking about how to deal with entities. So not giving that advice. It's just that a lot of people, I think, have this energetic mess that creates white noise around their head that they don't even realize, they're not even aware of. And just like our skin is really important, it's really important to have unbroken skin, because when the skin is broken, we suddenly have vulnerability to infection and, more damage happening to that compromised area and all of these kind of things. When our skin is healthy, it works really well. It allows oxygen. We can feel heat and light and have all these experiences where we interact with the world with this like miraculous, kind of amazing, remarkable barrier all through our body that does all of these really attuned things. And I'm a fan of also having an energy body that's very attuned and aligned with supporting you, and the integrity of that, not having it be permeable to inappropriate energy is of vital importance. So remember, I talked about the people throwing psychic attacks. If you're a boundaried person, or even if you're not, perhaps more so if you're not, but regardless, at some point somebody's going to be really unreasonably triggered with you. And the more mentally ill they are and the more outrageous the trigger, the more energy potentially could be generated. And if you have this like random, I just have spirit dialed all the time and I have those psychic pathways open, but I'm not really doing anything with them, and they're just default in one position, that's a pathway where things can come into your energy body. It's a level of openness that isn't particularly supporting you. So sure, it's tedious, it's kind of like, making your bed. I don't always make my bed, but there's a little bit of a tedious aspect. My grandmother's best efforts aside, did not get committed to making my bed in the beautiful way that she taught me. But for this, it is really useful. And maybe a better analogy is, we go through a process when we leave our home, especially if we have pets inside, of closing the doors. We're aware of whether the door is open or closed, especially if we have indoor cats. That's a particular, kind of thing. But also if we live in a place that has a lot of mosquitoes at a certain time of day, or all of these, we tend to, whether our doors are open, our windows are open, there's this extra process that we go through that's just thoughtful, like, oh, my car window is down and it looks like, water is going to fall vigorously from the sky. It would be good to put up the window. And similarly, I think it's really useful to tend our energy body to the same degree of, yeah, I can open it up and have these experiences, and then when I'm complete, I close the pathways and I really come home solidly. And it's a learnable skill. And honestly, it's not very fun or comfortable to just keep using your intention and focus to pull yourself into your body and be able to have volitional control over it. I don't love strength training, but I'm 50 years old and it's really wise for me to do this thing that's going to build muscle. And again, investment in future Katie, having a good experience, aging well, really, really helpful. So I set up lots of systems to be as efficient and make it as attainable as possible. But, I lean into making that happen, even though I don't like the process of my heart rate shooting up and those last couple of reps that build so much muscle where you're like, this is so frigging hard. You're really struggling for, 13, 14, and 15 of the overhead press that you're doing. And so I recognize it's a different kind of muscle and tiredness to use your awareness to track whether or not you're in your body, and then use your intention and focus to start to figure out where that muscle is that draws you back in. And I taught in-person shamanic journeying classes. You can get my classes as recordings in my academy if that's something that speaks to you. But in all the years of teaching, I found that a lot of my students went to shamanic reality a lot better than they came back from shamanic reality. And I've spent a lot of time kind of half in, half out, and it's just not as fun. You have a lot of brain fog and a lot of disorientation, and you can't think straight, and it really takes the aliveness of joy and connection and these really vital things away. So it's a little bit like, traveling to some amazing destination and then spending the whole time in the hotel. And There could be reasons for that if you caught a cold on the way or whatever, but there's kind of a missed experience if you don't, at some point venture out. Like if you go to Hawaii and you stay in the hotel room, there's a missed experience. And so in terms of getting the full value out of this crazy incarnation journey that we all decided to do, I think this is really important. And frankly, this will increase and hone your psychic ability. So being intentional about this will give you way, way, way better access to your guides. So it's, even if you're like, but I totally love that world, you'll get so much more out of that world by training your psychic ability and having more volitional control over it. So I just want to mention this because, again, we don't have the kind of training that we all go through. We learned about bacteria and wounds and, how to keep our drinking water safe. And, there are all these things that are sort of this common collective knowledge that most people really know and understand. And managing psychic ability is absolutely not on that list. And honestly, unless someone is in a lot of pain and suffering about it, there's a lot more money in teaching people to go than teaching people to come be in their bodies. People, are plunking down their money for training in, reading tarot cards or, things that connect with spirit, which is great. I really get the longing and the desire. It's a huge part of the joy in my life. Absolutely massive. So it's not making anyone bad or wrong. It's just noticing that this knowledge, even when people have it, isn't what people are paying for unless they're in a lot of suffering over the experience. And so as a result, again, it's not necessarily the most fun to get competent at this, but I can really make a strong argument for the improved quality of life. So if this is something that kind of applies and fits and you don't have a really clear sense of, where your awareness is at any given moment in time, I'd really invite you to think about at least running the experiment of working with this and seeing how it might change things for you. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.